All right, it's just about 12. So I'm gonna give like one more minute and then I'm gonna get started. Okay, officially 12:01. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So, yep. So I switched my colors up a little bit for today. So yes, fall color. Um, Today I'm going to talk about winter animal ID for lunch. So talk about ways we can. I won't actually give pictures of animals today. Actually, I'm going to give pictures of what we find. Usually during the winter time. So a lot of times it stands out a little bit more in the snow or perhaps just evidence. And you can use some of this beyond the winter, I should say. Okay, let's see if we decide to go on. So just a quick, if we have anybody new today, Women Owning Woodland is our program that's being developed to provide learning opportunities to women woodland owners and woodland enthusiasts. Extension is organizing field days, lunch and learns, and classes that are geared towards women forest landowners and forest enthusiasts. A Facebook page that provides some networking opportunities and a place to come with questions. And I don't have any current events. I usually give you guys an update on the current events. We will have December lunch and learns, but kind of with the start of the holiday season, probably not much else beyond the lunch and learns for the month of December, and then we'll start back with a lot more field days in January. So today's question is, how do we know what animals are in our area? So some ways that oftentimes we don't see animals. A lot of our wildlife is nocturnal, meaning they're more active at night, so we're less likely to see them, especially in the winter when those nighttime gets a little bit longer. We don't see as much of them. Or if you're like me, I leave for work in the dark, I come home from work in the dark. So anything I see is usually, I just see evidence of them in the light of day, or I just hear them at night. So there's other ways that we can see what animals are in our area besides just seeing them. It is very cool when we get to see the animal itself, but oftentimes we just see evidence of them. So our tracks, the only clues we have, are these the only sign that animals leave? Nope. So there's other things that we can find that is proof and helps with identification of animals in our area. So animal signs might include scat and pellets. So just some examples of animal scat, which is our official name for animal poop. So that's our scientific name. What can this tell us? So interesting things, if you're a scientist or want to be a citizen scientist, scat can tell us a lot about animals in our area. So it can tell us things like what they're eating. So if you look in this picture, it's kind of a little hard to see, but that is some raccoon scat, and it has like little bitty blackberry seeds in it. This is obviously probably during July, August that picture was taken, and that raccoon was eating ripe blackberries. So it can tell us what animals eat. It can tell us where they've been, so we can kind of keep track of if they're close to us, if they're utilizing habitat we're providing for them. This is evidence that they were there. Other signs of animals besides the animals themselves are trails, runs, or escape routes. We've probably all utilized a deer trail in the woods at one time or another, so they generally find the path of least resistance. So that's usually the trail that we also will follow. Again, this can give you a good idea, particularly if you're thinking about your property and providing habitat for wildlife. This gives us an idea of what parts of our property they're utilizing the most, because trails and runs and these escape routes, these are going to be the most heavily traveled areas that they use. We often find that these lead to things like water. So that's one of those necessary items for wildlife is water. So they often lead to that. It may lead to a good food source. So perhaps if you have like a food plot on your property, you'll see these deer trails back and forth from them. Oftentimes our larger animals are going to be the ones that leave evidence of trails, runs, or escape routes, and ones that aren't necessarily in large groups. So for example, turkeys, they do kind of travel in groups, but they don't often travel in a line. So it's not often that we see evidence of a trail for them, but they do like to walk through the forest and kind of graze on. So they're trying to eat acorns. And so they usually will kind of pick at the ground and scrape the leaves away so they can find any seeds, acorns, perhaps insects if it's a warm enough day. I've not been outside since this morning, but I've heard rumor it's supposed to be 75 today. So there would probably be some insects active today that turkeys would go along feeding on. So that's also evidence that the wildlife is there and that they're utilizing some aspect of the habitat. Dens, burrows, beds, lays, and nests. So there's lots of different terms that we use for areas of wildlife kind of utilizing an area. So just again, these are things that we can come across in winter. They usually stand out against the environment a little bit during the winter. So perhaps like this is a fox den and they have dug, out that fresh dirt. And so this stands out against our winter landscape. Same thing happens kind of in the snow. So if they have a burrow, we can see where that hole is. And there's usually, again, some type of trail that leads to that burrow if they're very active, particularly in the winter. So these are good evidence of wildlife utilizing, again, woods or forest or other habitat that we've provided for them. Sometimes we don't want to see these dens, burrows, or areas where they've kind of dug dirt out. So groundhogs, which they do tend to hibernate during the winter, so they are not usually active once we fall below an average temperature, but they can be a nuisance species because they will burrow underneath barns, they'll burrow underneath silos. So we do have that aspect too that we want to look for. Some other things that we can find during the winter, again, some of these they're not utilizing at the time, but it does help us know that they're there, particularly during the summer perhaps. But nests and beds and some of those things, again, will just stand out a little bit more against winter landscape. And so these functions that they have, again, are going to be habitat, rearing space. So most of our wildlife, they aren't going to bear their young until the next, usually late winter, early spring is when we'll start to see a lot of our wildlife have their young, but they will spend some of their winter prepping burrows or nests or beds for those young. Some other ones, again, these can be good or bad depending on your perspective and what wildlife it is and where you're looking. But things like gnaws, chews, rubs, and marking signs are also evidence of our winter wildlife. So here you can see kind of this big picture. This is evidence of a beaver. So they will gnaw on generally small trees, but they will go up to larger trees if that's necessary, or if they've run through kind of some of the smaller trees during that time. And beavers during the winter, they will spend a lot of their time in their dens that they've created. That's what they do. It's like when they make a beaver dam, they're creating a den and they'll utilize that through the winter. But they will come out occasionally, particularly to find fresh greens like this. So they eat this bark off these trees, and that's a lot of their food source. Over here, again, if you're a deer hunter, this is something that you are probably looking for if you're hunting this week. So this is a sign of a deer. they kind of pull away all of the debris on top of this, and then male deer will mark this, and this helps them attract does to them, and so they utilize that. We call this scrape. And then this is a rub. So particularly, we see a lot of evidence right now of it, but some of it has probably started to heal over on some of our trees. So even during now, they'll rub their antlers on trees to, again, kind of like put their scent out there and mark their territory. They'll also utilize these, so when they're dropping their velvet from their antlers, they'll utilize trees to help rub that velvet off. And that creates these rubs that we see. So again, evidence of deer. We also can see, again, like I talked a little bit about turkeys. So sometimes we'll walk through the woods and you'll see like the leaves very disturbed, kind of all in an area. And this is usually where a flock of turkeys has been in there foraging for, again, insects, seeds, acorns, kind of whatever they can find. We unfortunately also find some gnawing activity this time of year that's more of a nuisance to us as well. So for example, mice, rabbits, they aren't active during the winter, so they don't hibernate, and food can be scarce, particularly if we've had a long period of snow on the ground. And so rabbits, mice, sometimes some of our other small rodents like voles, they we'll see evidence of them on small trees. So they'll come up and gnaw on smaller trees and eat that bark for nutrition. So that, again, can be a nuisance, particularly if they find one of our fruit trees or one of our decorative trees that we've just planted. They can be a nuisance for that. So if you have particular trees that you would like to protect during the winter, it doesn't hurt to put a little bit of some type of fencing around the bottom or protection around it to prevent the scavenging animals during the winter. Again, also you can look for tooth marks, tracks, or scat around some of these other signs, and this can give us clues as to what it was. So this one I included just because we actually just concluded our first black bear season in Missouri, but our black bears, they do not go into a true hibernation, so you may see evidence of them throughout the winter. When it gets cold, they will den up and kind of go into a state of sort of a state of hibernation, but it's usually a very light hibernation because our winters we don't usually have like a deep winter that stays the entire time, so they aren't as hibernated as some of our ones that are further up north. But yes, we do sometimes see evidence of black bears where they have put claw marks on trees. So as evidence that we can sometimes see of animals is bones, teeth, fur, and feathers. So often barbed wire fence catches particularly some of our larger animals that go over it or through it or under it. So sometimes we'll find evidence of wildlife in the barbed wire. So generally for us in Missouri, what we find fur-wise stuck in barbed wire is going to be our white-tailed deer. It'll be coyotes, so they'll shimmy through there and they'll catch their fur and take a chunk off. We also sometimes find feathers. So we talked about winter birds last week. So if you're curious about, we talked a little bit about identifying them if you see them, but feathers can also provide us for IDing purposes. We can utilize those feathers. Again, this is just, if you really know your animals, you can tell what they are from the fur. In Missouri, we don't have as much variety, particularly of our larger like deer species. We just have pretty much white-tailed deer that move through Missouri. There are some elk in the southern part of the state, but for the most part, it's going to be white-tailed deer that's found in these areas. So some other evidence for the bones and teeth. So again, this time of year, if you're out in the woods, this is my favorite time to be out in the woods. I also love walking through a good snow-covered woods and seeing what we can find. This is the time you sometimes will find other proof of wildlife. So this is a deer jawbone and some antlers. So oftentimes if we find antlers this time of year, they have been dropped, not this year, but probably this past spring. So white-tailed deer will have their, will shed their antlers usually like between January and March is when they'll actually shed their antlers, and then they'll start to grow new ones over the summer, and they will have that velvet fur covering of them until about usually in September they start to rub the velvet off, and then they have from September again into January kind of the traditional antlers that we see. And so there's again a lot of people who like to go out and antler hunt, so they'll look just for these discarded antlers. The antlers do provide a good resource. So a lot of our smaller rodents, they will actually get calcium. So the antlers are kind of like a bone, and they're made of similar material as bones. And our mice, squirrels, voles, they will actually gnaw on the antlers to get some of their calcium intake. So usually if we don't find them, those wildlife do. So again, just more than just looking at footprints, there's scat, there's pellets, dens, burrows, beds, lays, nests, trails, runs, escape routes, bones, teeth, fur and feathers. So looking for notice, choose rubs, marking signs and feeding areas. All of these can help us learn about wildlife in our area. And then the other thing that we can use that is great for helping us identify which animals are utilizing our area are animal tracks. So right now is probably one of the trickiest times to look for animal tracks because we've had a pretty dry spell, pretty dry period of time, meaning we don't have as much mud or soft dirt for them to leave tracks in. But during the winter, when we get a good snow, that's a great time for us to go out and look at animal tracks because they show up very well. So animal tracks can help us record an animal's movement. It can give us a clue about an animal's behavior. So when we talked about like trails to different places, we can know where they're eating, where they're going to get a drink of water, where they're bedding down. And it's pretty fun because animals generally don't cover their tracks, so we can kind of track them that way. And sometimes if you're lucky and you're kind of following some animal tracks, you might come across that animal and catch a glimpse of it. Just for some information about looking at animal tracks. So animals have different gait patterns. So some are what we call pacers, meaning that they're like right and left foot move kind of at the same time, and then they have this distinct pattern of right foot, I'm doing left foot, right foot, and most of the animals that we look at are actually going to walk on 4 feet. So this would be a back and a front foot that we're looking at. There's other ones that are diagonal walkers, meaning that they move their right and left, their right foot and front foot and back foot together, and then they'll move their front foot and back foot together, giving us kind of this interesting diagonal pattern. Other animals are what we call bounders, and so these are going to be like our river otters, our rabbits. So they kind of bound, meaning that their front feet kind of drop at the same time and their back feet are going to stop at the same time, and then they're going to jump to the next one. And then our gallopers, this is going to be our anybody that kind of has a running pace, like deer, for example, would fit into our galloping category. So in just some looks at some of our more common winter species that we can find out there and evidence of them. So this is, there's a pond here. It's hard to kind of tell in this picture. And then this is actually kind of an otter slide. And so you can see there are some tracks in there, but during the winter, or if they can find a muddy enough spot along a pond or river that they're utilizing, they will actually just slide on their bellies, just just like a little kid, they'll slide around and slide towards the water. They do generally spend a lot of their time in the water, so they're not going to spend as much time on land. But during freezes, so if their pond or lake or even the river that they're close to is frozen over, they will kind of seek out the open areas if they can find them and utilize that, because they are going to be eating things like fish, crayfish, anything that they can find usually in the water. And then over here, so I've picked out tracks and scat of some common animals, but this is otter scat. So in this one, otter scat can look kind of similar to raccoon scat, but generally our otter scat one, if it's fresh, it's going to have kind of a distinct smell to it. So otters, again, pretty much eat all aquatic species. So they're going to eat a diet of fish and crayfish. And during the summer, they'll also include frogs with that diet. So this it's hard to see in here, but this is a lot of fish scales and like crayfish exoskeletons that's in here. And then again, if it's really fresh, it's going to have kind of a distinct fish smell to it. Think kind of like the penguin house, because they also have a diet of fish, so it kind of smells similar to that. So that's good evidence that it's otter rather than raccoon. Next one's bobcat. So this is one of our big cat species. They are, again, smaller than a cougar, mountain lion, whichever term you want to use, but generally larger than a house cat. And they have kind of a distinct paw print that we see. And then scat-wise, there's a scale down here. So this is 4 inches. So just kind of give you an idea of scale. Tends to look like kind of, again, our typical house cat scat. Say that 5 times fast, but a little bit on the larger size because it is a larger cat than most of our house cats. And they tend to stay active during the winter. Sometimes you'll find evidence of them. So we'll see, like, particularly if the snow's been down for a little while, you'll see where there's mouse dens. And this is one of my favorite things about like winter snowfall when we're on a field. You can actually see where the mice have had their burrows and where they come out, and you can see their tracks around it. But a lot of times you can actually see where bobcats have hunted for those mice during the winter, so they'll feed on them. So that's where we'll find them. Coyote. This is one of our ones that they are tend to be a galloper. Kind of see their tracks. So front tracks and back tracks. So they tend to gallop where they go. And scat-wise over here, again, looks a little bit like dog scat, like a domestic dog scat. Tends to have, so their diet tends to be mostly things like rabbit, mice, squirrels if they can find them. So mostly they're going to eat a lot of mammals. So they tend to have a lot of fur in their scat as evidence of what their diet is. So coyotes stay pretty active during the winter. Squirrel. So we see squirrels out a little bit during the winter, but they will, if it gets very cold, they'll den up in their trees and kind of wait out in somewhat of not a hibernation, but again, kind of a torpor. Again, you can see their tracks. They have, because again, they are tree climbers, they have kind of these extended paws so that they can hold on and wrap the trees. And so you can see that in their tracks. And then they do have, we see all 5 toes of squirrels in their tracks. And then this is squirrel scat. Turkeys. So our wild turkeys tend to stay active during the winter as well. So they'll be out foraging, and you can find that their tracks are pretty common to find throughout the winter and in the snow. So in just again, pretty much size is going to help distinguish this from other bird species because they are our largest ground dwelling bird that we have. Scat again looks kind of just like a extra large bird scat, which is what it is. Deer. So deer will have kind of a distinct hoof print. In the snow, it sometimes gets lost and looks more just like you know, a hole in the snow. But if you look very closely, you'll see the very distinct two hoof signs to it, which indicates deer. If it is larger and more rounded, that would indicate an elk. So again, we generally only find elk in our south central counties. So they were reintroduced into the environment of and into the quote unquote wild. They started them out at Peck Ranch in a fenced in area, but they have since taken down the fences. And so we do have free roaming elk, but generally restricted to that Shannon, Carter, Oregon County area that we would see them. So pretty much mostly you'll see deer tracks if it is a hoofed animal. And then deer scat, and their scat does kind of change a little bit with their diet. So depending on what they're grazing on, it can change during the winter when their diet becomes a little bit more fibrous. Their droppings will sometimes be more, instead of they'll still have the individual pellets to it, but it'll be kind of clumped together more. And this is usually when they're eating that higher fiber, grazing more on things like twigs and acorns through the winter. Rabbit. So these are some of our tracks for rabbit. So, and again, they generally hop or bound where they're going. So they're going to kind of land, their tracks will land in that design. And then a look at their scat. And if you're thinking, oh, it looks kind of like deer scat, it does look very similar. However, rabbit scat tends to be rounder pellets. It also tends to contain more like undigested grasses in it. So their stomach works a little bit different than a deer's stomach, and deer tend to digest. They have a stomach kind of similar to a cow where they ruminate, and it digests the grass further down, whereas rabbits do not. So we tend to have more fibrous pieces in it. Raccoon. So these guys have these, you know, little paws. You can see there, again, 5 toes as evidence in their tracks, kind of like little paw prints with those very distinct, sharp, you know, nails, which helps distinguish from things like house cats that you might mix them up with. And then raccoon scat. So this is kind of a look at shape and color. Raccoons do have a really varied diet. So they're very opportunistic when it comes to feeding. And so kind of like whatever's ripe or available is what they're going to feed on. So if you've, you know, live, you know, close to woods and put out food like dog food or cat food, you'll know that they will make use of that. They will get into people's trash cans and make use of human food. So again, very opportunistic. I thought this was a picture that was appropriate as it is persimmon seeds. So we're kind of at the tail end of persimmon falling, but they'll utilize, you know, they'll take advantage of those fruits when the pawpaw are ripening. They'll take advantage of that. They do also eat, so they're an omnivore. So again, very, very opportunistic based on what's available, but they will also eat things like crayfish and frogs if they can find them. They'll also eat mussels. So they have the capability of opening their shells and eating mussels. So again, a very varied diet, and sometimes their scat looks different depending on what they're eating at the time. Next one is beaver. So we talked about evidence of them when they're gnawing on trees and kind of eating on trees next to water, but they have kind of a distinct track. So a little hard to see in this picture, but there's footprints, but then there's also this interesting track. Well, that's where they have drugged their tail. So again, that is a pretty distinctive track for wildlife in Missouri. Again, you'd expect to see this close to where beaver den is, or close to water. So they also live on streams and rivers and take advantage of that. Again, there's their scat. We don't see as much beaver scat as you would, not that you would expect to see a lot, but they tend to also have their droppings kind of in their dens or in the water sometimes. And so not a super common find. And then I left this one in here, so black bear. So again, this is a fairly large track. So if you were to see it, it would be quite large and fairly distinct. We do only have black bears in Missouri, so that's the only type of bear track that you would find. Their scat is quite large. And again, they're kind of an opportunistic feeder as well. They do generally stick with things like berries and fruits, fresh grass, like late grass. They do graze on that. They'll scrape away. So you saw the scratches in kind of one of my first slides. They'll also find like dead logs and kind of scrape away at the bark and decaying wood and eat things like grubs that they find there, or beetles that are in that wood as part of their diet. They are similar to raccoons, where if they can find a free meal, they'll take advantage of that. So if you have bears in your area, we don't advise leaving dog food or cat food out overnight, because they will take advantage of that. They also will take advantage of things like compost piles and trash cans if there's food that's in them. So again, just if you're in a bear area, it's good to keep those things locked up overnight. Our black bears, again, they do go into a form of hibernation, but it's usually a lot shorter than their relatives to the north, where winter tends to be longer and deeper. So it's not too unusual for us to see them active kind of into the winter months until they actually go into their hibernation. And it is, I've heard of male bears, particularly in southern Missouri, that are still wandering around throughout the winter, where the females, they will generally den up to at least give birth, and then their young will stay in those dens until they're old enough to leave. And then just kind of interesting look at what we can sometimes see in the snow. So I joke about what happened here. So this is evidence of a rabbit that was here, and then some type of bird of prey that came down and kind of made a meal of that rabbit. So I enjoy the snow, because I think that, one, it makes the woods have kind of a very quiet, serene sound to them, but also there's a lot of things that we can see proof of that we can't see other times when there's no snow present like this. So, and then just thinking about winter wildlife habitat. So if you are thinking about trying to attract winter, wildlife, or letting them take advantage of your property during the winter, things to think about are open water. So if we have just shallower, like, we call them wildlife ponds sometimes, we just have shallow water systems in place that can deter wildlife from utilizing our property during the winter. So they do need an open water source if they're a species that stays active during the winter. Habitat, so they do need places for shelter, particularly during winter storms or particularly cold stretches that we have. So if you think about species like quail, having good cover for them to utilize, or for thinking about squirrels, having den trees for them to utilize, that can definitely help winter wildlife and help them, again, utilize your property during the winter, or have them on your property during the winter. And the other thing is food. So food is definitely not nearly as readily available during the winter for a lot of our wildlife. And so it can be, depending on what they feed on, it can be kind of a difficult time for them to find enough. So oftentimes towards the end of winter, if we've had a lot of snow, our deer will start to look a little on the thin side because they're trying to find stuff to graze on. And this is the place where, again, we can kind of tie in some of our other management practices. So things like if we have done some of our forest management practices and opened up the forest floor to do regeneration for like our oaks, for example, not only is it good for our forest because we're regenerating oaks, but some of that regeneration, smaller trees that are growing in that space, that provides a lot of winter browse for our particularly deer species. And so that can be important when we talk about some of those larger animals. And then just space. So that one, it's not something we can create, but if we have it, leaving kind of open areas for wildlife to use or refuge spaces for them, that can benefit them through the winter. Any questions for me today? I'll stop sharing and you can see me, but feel free to unmute if you have a question or type it in the chat box. It looks like there's one question in the chat box. I'm glad you've enjoyed, Jerry. It's not often I get to spend my lunchtime talking about animal scat, but it's always interesting to talk about and to see what it looks like. Well, while you're thinking about questions, if you have any, just a reminder, next week we're going to talk about tree pruning. So we'll talk about, so winter is a great time to get out and prune trees because they are, one, in their dormancy, so they're not going to attract insects because they're not growing and alive. So when we cut them, prune them, they're not going to attract a lot of insects. There's not going to be a lot of like bacteria and diseases active during the winter. So it's a good time to prune them. It also gives a chance to kind of dry out and heal just a little bit before we go back into the growing season. So that's next week. And then and it's hard to believe next week is Thanksgiving. And then after that, when we come back from Thanksgiving, we'll talk about kind of Missouri's Christmas tree industries and an overview of some of our farms that we have here in Missouri and what kind of trees they grow. So, and then hopefully next week I'll have December's all lined out. We'll probably talk a little bit about winter invasive management. So that's always a good thing to talk about. Carolyn, I'm glad we helped you figure it out. Yep, deer do have very variable scat from time to time. All right, any other questions before I wrap up? Hopefully everyone gets out to enjoy the weather today. See, it's good for us. I guess maybe not as good for deer hunters, but good for, just enjoying the outdoors. But that last sunshine before we go further into winter. All right, well, have a great rest of the day. Thank you.